Hi, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. If you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the upcoming book, The Only Witness, a historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, we'll be speaking with Dr. Joe Bergeron. He's a medical doctor and syndenologist, and he has used his background to understand aspects of the death of Jesus from what is shown on the cloth and what is known historically. There are some incredibly interesting conclusions that come out of his work. So let me tell you a little bit more about Joe. Joe Bergeron, MD, is a specialist in physical medicine and rehabilitation. He has written a peer-reviewed article for the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine on Jesus's cause of death, and a collaborative article with Gary Habermas, PhD, in the Irish Theological Quarterly on hallucination hypotheses seeking to explain away the resurrection of Jesus. Dr. Bergeron's research also led him to study the Shroud of Turin. His book is the culmination of his research. It's called The Crucifixion of Jesus. A medical doctor examines the death and resurrection of Christ. And here it is. And it's available in Amazon and wherever. Dr. Bergeron lectures in conferences, churches, and universities on the Shroud of Turin and medical perspectives of the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ. Joe, thank you for being here. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Guy. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Yes, absolutely. So glad to have you. And so Joe is going to actually do a presentation. But before you do that, Joe, tell us your backstory on how you got involved in the Shroud of Turin.
Well, as you said, I'm a practicing physician. I'm a specialist in physical medicine and rehabilitation. A lot of folks may not know what that is, and there are a lot of facets to that kind of specialty. My concentration has been in evaluating and treating musculoskeletal injuries, and I've done medical legal work in that regard. And so that's what got me interested in studying the crucifixion of Jesus and the mechanism of Jesus' death and so on. And in the context of doing that, I had to study the Shroud of Turin because it was part of Dr. Barbet's hypothesis that Jesus had suffocated to death. And there are logical problems with that, and that kind of forced me into studying the Shroud of Turin in a way that I hadn't previously been interested in. But I've studied everything I get my hands on about the death and resurrection of Christ, and the Shroud of Turin fell into that study. And so that's how I come to you today, and it's an honor to be with you.
Yeah, fantastic. And yes, Barbet has definitely done quite a bit of work on that. And your conclusions are actually going to be very interesting. And I'm definitely looking forward to learning more about that. So, okay, so the stage is set. The stage is yours. Why don't you go ahead and share your screen, and then I'll let you go. And every once in a while, I'll present a few questions to you.
Sounds good. Okay, I'm going to... everybody wants to know whether the Shroud of Turin is authentic or not. And I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk specifically about the examination of the man, the image of the man, and the examination of the cloth and what it can be objectively seen there. And listeners can form their own conclusion about authenticity. What we're really after is a scientific observation and what we can glean from that. And authenticity becomes a subjective opinion of the listener. And I meet people of every stripe, some that have a very emotional commitment to believing the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus. And, credible Christian folks that believe the opposite. And then folks that don't believe anything about it. So what we really want to do is look at the facts, and listeners can come to their own conclusions about the shroud.
Yeah, I think if you, there you go.
Yeah, sorry. I
Yep,
don't.
no problem. Sometimes it's interesting how it works or doesn't work when you're trying to share it. So please.
I'm going to talk to you briefly about the burial customs of the Jewish people in the first century. Again, the physical examination of the man of the shroud, evidence of Roman crucifixion as described in the gospel that are present on the shroud, evidence that the shroud could date to the time of Christ, the physical and chemical characteristics of the cloth itself, a potential explanation of how the image of the man was formed and where I believe the cloth was manufactured. It was a cultural norm for the Jews, if they were a family of means, to have a family tomb that was cut into stone. And here is an archaeological find where the entrance would be a small room, not tall enough to stand up in, but a place to prepare the remains of the deceased. The practices are well known. They would be washed, then they would be anointed with perfumes and aromatic spices and flowers and so forth, wrapped in a shroud. The plants would be sprinkled over the burial area. They would be placed in a wooden box. When the soft tissue of components of decay were gone and only bones were left, the bones would be collected and placed in a bone box or an ossuary. And then you see rivulets here in the wall where the deceased would be placed into the wall after their bodies were prepared. If they did not have the means to have a family tomb, they might be buried in the ground. Here you see an archaeological find of the remains of someone wrapped in a shroud and buried in the ground. Here's the Shroud of Turin. And you can see that it has the characteristics of a long cloth that could be used as a burial shroud, as we just saw. It has the front and back image of the crucified man, or who appears to be crucified. You see the dark lines that go parallel to the man are scorch spots from the fire of 1532. You see repair patches that look like triangles there, that were the repairs of the nuns of the Poor Clares after that fire. And then you see what people have called poker holes that are kind of in an L-shaped, and those are thought to be from incense that may have been waved over the cloth, as it may have been used as a cloth on a table during worship. The image of the man is very faint. Dr. Zugaby in his book says that when he was standing in line to see the shroud, he couldn't see it until he got fairly close to it. And pretty much every image you see is enhanced on somewhat. This is an unenhanced image 2 to 3 meters away from the shroud itself. And you can see that it is very, very faint. And when you're up close to it, many people say it's very difficult to see the image. And as when you're far away from it, it's very difficult to see. So it's very faint. Secunda Pia, your listeners probably know, took the famous photograph in 1898. Now, what he did was the photographic technology in that time, they would use plates with emulsion on them that would be light sensitive. And the emulsion he used was accidentally or inadvertently more sensitive to bluish tones. And the net effect from that was that it enhanced the image so that it could be seen in a way that had never been seen before. And you see on the left the photo negative, which kind of has characteristics of a photo positive, and then on the right you see the actual photo positive. Now, you understand that photographic technology didn't really occur or exist until the 1820s, and people started taking photographs. So this long predates that time, and the Shroud of Turin is not a photograph by any stripe. I don't mean to suggest that, but it has characteristics that are similar. And Pia's photograph kind of brought to the world's attention the image that couldn't be seen this way previously. The physical examination of the man is about 70 kilograms estimated weight, about 72 inches tall or 138 centimeters. The back image is a little bit longer, which would be consistent with a slight flexion of the trunk and legs that would occur with rigor mortis. The neck is flexed. I've heard people in a quandary about why don't we see the neck? Why don't we see the neck? Well, if someone dies by crucifixion, their neck would be flexed like that. And people have suggested, or one objection I've heard is that, well, the flexions that you see in the body could suggest that Jesus wasn't dead because, it's flexed and rigor mortis takes a couple hours to set in. And for a sedentary person like myself, it would probably take a couple hours for rigor to set in. But someone that dies a violent death in a high metabolic state can go into rigor mortis very quickly. There's a concept of cadaveric spasm, which is almost instantaneously. So Jesus was dead before they took him down from the cross, from the gospel accounts, and rigor mortis could have set in very rapidly. And that, I think, easily explains why we don't see the neck, because it's flexed. There's excoriations on the forehead. The right upper lip and jaw are swollen. The nasal cartilage is separated. I think everybody knows the nasal prominence is cartilage, it's not bone. We would call it a broken nose, but it's cartilage. There's puncture wounds on the scalp. There's blood flow from the puncture wounds, which would be consistent with clot disruption. There are, depending on who counts them, 100 or more bidirectional scourge marks that have a dumbbell-shaped type of imprint. And Dr. Rogers, and I'm citing work of Ray Rogers largely as we go through this, among others, but he saw visible or slight serum halos there by ultraviolet light. And there's abrasions on the shoulder, which some believe are signs that he was carrying the patibulum, which would be the horizontal section of the cross, which would be what was carried to the crucifixion site. The vertical section was permanently placed in the ground. There is a puncture wound in the chest on the right between the fifth and sixth rib, and blood flow from that. And again, just to look at the shroud images again, you see blood emanating from the puncture wounds. You see, I don't know if you can see my arrow here, the blood goes around the back as if the individual is lying on their back. You see blood rivulets from the puncture wounds in the wrist. You can see some evidence of flexion at the legs and at the feet here in slightly different positions. These would be signs of rigor mortis.
Mm.
The puncture wounds in the scalp are a peculiar finding, and it almost, if it came from the crown of thorns, it really couldn't be anybody but Jesus, or it would be hard to explain it as being anybody else. Crowns were common in the Roman Empire and in the Roman culture, and the most honored crown in Rome, in ancient Rome, would be called the crown of grass, and how that was obtained would be by unanimous vote of the army. A general who, by his brilliance and bravery, saved the army from destruction and led them to victory. They would collect plant material from the area they had conquered and make a crown out of it for the general. It was a very rare thing. We don't even really have anything like that in our culture. And I believe, and I'm not the only one, that when they made the crown of thorns for Jesus, they were mocking him as if he had obtained the crown of grass.
Yeah, if you don't mind, one thing that I've run across there as well for the crown is whether it was regular for a crucified man to be crowned. And it seemed to me, based on the research that I've found, is that that's relatively unusual. Is that what you also found as well?
Yes, it would not be part of the usual Roman crucifixion practice, and that's why I say it. It's a very peculiar finding, and it really strongly points to the image being the image of Jesus Christ. The condemned person would carry the horizontal section to the cross naked through the street, carrying the titulus crucis, which would name the crimes for which they were being executed in the local language, the legislative language of Latin, and Greek being the common language of the Mediterranean world. And here you see the depiction of the Tau cross, which is what they would have used in Jesus' place and time, where the soldiers would lift the horizontal section after the arms were fixed and place it on top of the stipes, the vertical section, by a mortise and tenon coupling. You'd asked me the other day where was the titulus crucis nailed or put on the cross? And I'm not aware of any reference to that, or even where or how it would have been placed there. But I thought to show you, this is an interesting slide. This is the oldest known depiction of crucifixion. It dates to the late 1st or early 2nd century. It's the Crucifixion of Alcamilla, a female, which is unusual. The name is inscribed above the shoulder on the right. But what you see here are, in the caricature, are depictions of the scourging, the feet and hands being affixed. And I want you to notice the shape of the cross is a Tau cross, the shape of a capital T in the English language. Yes.
Yeah. One thing that I thought is kind of interesting as well, in the Gospels, it says that Simon of Cyrene helped to carry the cross.
Yes.
And that actually kind of has two things with it. One is, was the cross tied onto Jesus as he was carrying it? And then did Simon of Cyrene help him to carry it, or did he actually physically carry the cross or the patibulum himself? Did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, that's kind of an off-topic subject, but it's a pointer to that Jesus was progressing into shock. Jesus died of traumatic hemorrhagic shock. He didn't die of suffocation. Traumatic hemorrhagic shock is the effect of blood loss. And so the Romans weren't going to carry the patibulum.
Yeah.
So, and Jesus wasn't able to do it because the initial symptoms of shock are lightheadedness, dizziness, feeling sweaty, clammy, heart palpitations, feeling confused, that kind of thing. So that's kind of a indicator that he was progressing into that, and which is also a partial explanation of why Jesus died so quickly, because crucifixion could take days, and Jesus was beaten. Again, we're kind of a little bit off topic, but I've studied this for years, so I can talk for hours and hours and hours if you want. But Jesus was beaten, bludgeoned twice. He was beaten at the secret trial at the home of the high priest. Then he was, and they would have beat him. That's where they put a towel on him and beat him up and said, "Who's prophesying? Who's hitting you, Christ?" And then they took him to the Romans, where a whole company of soldiers, it says, beat him, and they put the crown of thorns on him. So by this time, he had been beaten more than the average crucifixion victim, and he couldn't walk to the crucifixion site. The estimates of Jesus walking were about roughly 2.2 kilometers through the evening, depending on which crucifixion site you think is the accurate one. But in this slide, folks have thought that the markings that you see between the red lines here may suggest that that's how he was attempting to carry the patibulum. The victim would be whipped with a flagrum, which would have leather strips with lead beads sewn into the end. More than one soldier would participate in the beating, so that there would be bidirectional marks, which is what you see in the Shroud of Turin. Here you see that these scourge marks match what we believe and understand to be the flagrum of that. Now, you were asking me if the body was washed, and I would say, about the shroud here, we don't see blood all over the cloth. So the blood would have been washed off. Now, Dr. Rogers did see serum residue around the scourge marks, but not blood, not sweat, tears, any other body effluents, nothing. So that was all washed off. There aren't those kind of contaminants on the cross, which would be easily detectable chemically. And if you said, okay, we're going to wash the body, how long is it going to take to dry? A couple hours? We can just make an estimate. So if he's seeing, if there's slight residual of serum near these, it would suggest that the gross blood and all the other effluents, that the sweat, whatever, would be washed off, but the cloth placed on the body before it was fully dried off, maybe a couple hours, within a couple hours or so. So the body could have been washed very quickly, even on the way down from the cross, because they were in a hurry. And so that would be one indicator that the body had been washed. And then after the body's washed, and then there's bleeding emanating from the puncture wounds, that would have been considered unclean, and they would not have washed it again.
Mm. Well, and you make a good point too, in that if you could actually today detect sweat and it hasn't been detected, I would imagine that, he just walked 2 miles or 2 kilometers. He just carried this 60-pound patibulum or was whipped like crazy, and he was under stress, and therefore he would have sweat quite a bit. And if there's no sweat found on the cloth, then that would mean that he would have had to have had this sweat cleaned off.
Well, yes, and not only that, it's, as I said at the beginning, that's part of the customary preparation for the body. They were going to wash the body. That's what they did. Now, Jesus' preparation was incomplete, but yes, you're correct in that they didn't find that on the shroud itself, which would be detectable. And, Jesus would have been really sweaty, really clammy, because you're talking about an adrenergic reaction, the fight or flight sort of reaction, where he's in a high state of anxiety. He's going to be sweating, clammy, to whatever they washed him off with would be a fairly dirty cloth. But those exudates are not on the shroud, which is a strong indicator that the body was washed and wrapped in the shroud before it was fully dried off, by evaporation, I suppose. How the hands were nailed. Now, this is an interesting thing. Dr. Barbet did experiments on hands he amputated. And if you drive a nail through the center of the hand, it'll pull out with about 100 pounds of distraction force. It would really hurt, but it would pull out between the fingers. He found that if he drove the nail through the hand like you see here, which is basically if you bend your ring finger down as far as you can to the vertical wrist crease in your palm and drive a nail through that spot, it'll go through the wrist bones without fracturing them. And he did that a dozen times and had what we see here in this X-ray. That would macerate or transect or cut in half the median nerve that goes to this part of the hand, which is what the nerve that's pinched in carpal tunnel syndrome. So it'd be outlandishly painful, but it would be like that. Now, I want to show you a couple of things here. We don't see the thumbs, and I've heard people say, "Well, why don't we see the thumbs? Why don't we see the thumbs?" And they're in a quandary about it, and all sorts of explanations. But I think the explanation, to me at least, it seems pretty obvious. People have said, "Well, if you mash the nerve, it's going to cramp the hand." Well, yes, it will, but as soon as you remove the nerve supply to those muscles, they go flaccid, they go dead. So the posture of the hand would be like this. And you see that in some iconography. Some people knew that and put it in their artwork. But the thumb has complex movement. So it adducts from the palm and laterally adducts, and then it rotates here at the base of the thumb and adducts across the hand. It opposes the other fingers. So if you drive a nail through that spot, it will tether these muscles and pull the thumb inward. And then again, rigor mortis would have set in rapidly with a violent death like this and held the thumbs like that. I think that's the most straightforward and obvious reason why we don't see them.
Mm.
And then I want you to see the bleeding from the wrist here. Dr. Zugaby pointed out, this is not what it would look like if the individual were alive. If the vascular system were pressurized by the beating heart, it wouldn't look like this. There would be a more continuous and larger discharge of blood, even though the primary circulation of the hand is not affected here by that nail, as in Dr. Barbet's experiments. Still, you would have, more blood. The rivulets of blood on the arms of the man in the Shroud of Turin is not a lot of blood.
Mm.
I give people injections every day with a small needle the size of a pencil mark on your paper, and sometimes they have a lot of blood if there's a small vein that happens to be in the way. This is blood that oozed from those wounds after the individual is dead, and I think that's clear. And now here's another interesting thing. The image of the man occurred after the blood was on the cloth, because the image is not underneath the blood. A lot of people probably know that, but it's a peculiar thing, because first off, if you were gonna paint this image, would you paint the blood stains first and then paint the man around it? That's kind of counterintuitive. And then if you were going to paint blood at all, would you use blood to paint blood? Because blood, blood's kind of living tissue. It will change. It will coagulate in the jar if you set it there, and it turns dark. So you wouldn't use blood to paint blood. Mm. But the take-home point here is that this is blood oozing from a dead body. It's not blood oozing from an individual that's alive. Mm. Dr. Barbet thought that those blood signs indicated that Jesus was changing position on the cross, that he was suffocating. And just as a side point, the idea that Jesus suffocated is a modern idea, modern meaning in the past 100 years. It was originated with a French surgeon named Lebec and a Czechoslovakian surgeon named Hynek, and then became popularized by Dr. Barbet. And that's how I ended up studying the Shroud of Turin. But I would just point out here that ancient literary references to crucifixion are devoid of anybody thinking that or describing any of those people having trouble breathing. And here's Eusebius, who was the bishop of Caesarea, which was the seat of Roman government in Judea. He saw crucifixions. He lived during that time. And he said, others again were crucified, some as malefactors usually are, and some, even more brutally, were nailed in opposite manner and heads downward and kept alive until they should perish of hunger. Eusebius thought they died of deprivation. He thought they died of hunger. He thought they starved to death. And again, because crucifixion could take days. This is a side point, I know, but I gave you references. Folks can look up this in detail, and Dr. McGovern's article, I think, puts that whole idea to rest very well. The idea that Jesus suffocated is just, it's a modern invention, and it's not supportably, sort of medically.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I see your point as well, and because I think most, and I think you're going to get to it, but most people or theories had it where you had to push up on your legs to be able to exhale because of the way your arms were, and then your lungs, I think, would fill up with liquid or whatever, and then also because you couldn't exhale, then you would asphyxiate because you weren't able to exhale. And that seems to be the old argument. And what you have is then certainly, I guess the new argument as to what really caused the death of Jesus.
Well, it's unfortunate that it has become part of church folklore, and that every Easter you're going to hear a sermon about how Jesus suffocated. But again, that really came from Dr. Barbet, and that was based on, and listeners can get my book and read the explanation, or they can get Dr. Barbet's book, which is excellent in many respects. But he kind of made that argument based on suspension torture that was part of the Nazi penal code in Appendix 1 in his book. He describes death of an individual by suspension torture that occurred in 3.5 hours. But that's not analogous to crucifixion because the arms were suspended directly overhead, the feet were unsupported, and sometimes weights were placed on the feet of the individual. It was a horrible thing that they did, and if they prolonged that torture to more than 3 hours, it would extend to murder. So yes, it's a flawed analogy. And then Dr. Barbet looked at the blood flow images on the hand and said, oh, look, he was changing positions on the cross. That's why there's a bifurcation of the blood. It was an a priori conclusion to fit his idea. And so, again, not to throw stones at him, his book is brilliant in many ways, but that was an unfortunate erroneous conclusion that became part of church folklore, and probably always will be, because I'm trying to stamp it out, but I can't. And people that come to my lectures are mostly the pastors don't come. It's the other folks. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, in John chapter 19, John describes the spear wound to Jesus' chest as water and blood as two different things, and we can understand that easily. Fluid can collect around the lungs even with blunt trauma, and it's going to be clear unless there's penetrating trauma. That's called a pleural effusion. When the spear enters the chest, it will first encounter clear fluid, and then when the heart is ruptured, the blood will mix with that, and it will give that appearance of blood. So it will first appear clear, then secondly appear to be blood, and that's easily explainable. And again, you see the puncture wound, and then you see the blood oozing around to the back. So the body was lying in supine or on the back.
Yep.
Moving on to a discussion of the cloth. Linen was used everywhere in the ancient world, still used today, and it's a very, very stable sort of cloth. The oldest linen garment is the Tarkan dress, which dates to the mid 4th millennia BC. So it's really old. And if you take linen and keep it in a clean and dry environment and protect it, it would last indefinitely, or essentially forever. So it's not surprising that a piece of linen could survive to modern times that dates back to Jesus' day. This is from the Prey Codex. Prey is the guy's name that found the book, but we see an artistic depiction which obviously it can't be anything other than the Shroud of Turin. And the reason is that it shows the cloth itself, and the artist is trying to depict the herringbone pattern, and he depicts the poker holes, that people call it poker holes, but it's where the incense burnt holes into the cloth. So it's clearly a depiction of the shroud before the fire of 1432. And this book dates to 1190. So the shroud is very old. Now we know the provenance of the shroud of mid-14th century, and before that it becomes literary sorts of references and things that people can review. It's not a point of interest to me specifically, but it's certainly older than the carbon dating. Now, most people know, I think, that the carbon dating was a sampling error, where you see here that a piece of the shroud about the size of your small finger was cut out of the corner and then cut into strips and sent to a lab for carbon dating. And I don't think people take issue with the lab analysis per se, but what the problem is, it's sampling error, because it's well established that there were cotton fibers mixed with linen fibers. And so the sample was contaminated. In Leviticus 19:19, the Jews did not mix fibers when they were weaving cloth. So it would not be a cultural norm for them to mix uh, cotton with linen for the fabric, and that's only seen there in the. So basically, it's a repair that occurred to the cloth, and what they sampled was a repair area where cotton had been woven into the fringe of the cloth before it was sewn to the Holland cloth to protect it. Linen is harvested from the linseed plant. On the left, you see linen fibers, and they basically look, something like a bamboo shoot, and then it's got these dark specks here that are growth nodes. Now, in the growth nodes, that's an important observation because it has a compound called lignin, and lignin evolves over time a compound called vanillin, which is part of vanilla and artificial vanilla flavor. And I've read that 40% of commercial artificial vanilla flavor is harvested from linen. On the right side of the screen, you see the cotton fibers. And here you can see from the repair, the cotton fibers look very, very different. I mean, it's obvious under the microscope that the cotton fibers look kind of like a piece of a spiral tape. And the linen fibers look kind of like a bamboo shoot. They're clearly the same thing. Anyone can see that. And the cotton fiber on the upper part of the slide has pigment on it. It's colored, and the one underneath it is not. And so the presence of lignin and the evolution of vanillin from lignin allows us to estimate the age of the cloth. And because it's a chemical reaction that occurs, and it occurs very, very slowly. But we can calculate the rate of a chemical reaction. The rate of a chemical reaction can be known, and Dr. Rogers and his colleagues calculated the rate constant, and I provided you with a reference of how they did the math for that. But using the Arrhenius equation, they were able to estimate the age of the cloth. One of the problems is that the temperature history of the cloth was unknown. We know that there are some burn spots on there, but the temperature gradient was steep, and there's not a temperature effect on the unburned parts of the cloth. And so that would mean it never got over the 300-degree mark Fahrenheit, and it probably was never frozen. So, but other than that, we can't tell what the age was, and it forces us to speculate or provide a range of potential dates for the age of the cloth. And again, Dr. Rogers did the math on this, but he estimated the age of the cloth to be between 1,300 and 3,000 years old.
Yeah, so that would take it to roughly AD 700 back to BC 1000, I guess. So yeah, very interesting. And what's interesting too about this is you have the radiocarbon dating, but very few people are familiar with this one. It's the knowledge of the radiocarbon dating is like 100 times the knowledge of this one, and it's just fascinating to see how everybody looks at the carbon dating and says, "Up, it must be fake," whereas there's all these other tests, including this one, which is pretty specific, and and then nobody really knows about this one.
Well, it seems like everything about the Shroud of Turin is about, in the media, is about sensationalism. Like we talked the other day. There was a news organization that came out and said, "Oh, it's authentic," but a couple of years later, they had a news piece that said it was fraud. And with the carbon dating, it was in the news media. Oh, people have proved it's a hoax and all this stuff, and they dated it to 1260 to 1390. You've got an artistic image of the shroud that's at 1190. You have to ask yourself, was there a problem there? And then once you know that there was a sampling problem, that they could have, scientifically, they should have sampled the areas all over the cloth, but they didn't. They sampled one swatch. And in fairness, they sent it to 3 different labs, but it was one sample. And they, as soon as they knew it was contaminated, they should have stopped. But But anyway, that is not to belabor that discussion, but it
Yeah,
was
yeah, and there's a lot. And by the way, Joe Marino, I don't know if you've seen any of his books, but he's got a really interesting expose on all of the politics surrounding that radiocarbon dating. So
yeah.
yeah, and
Yes, I'm a little bit aware of that.
yeah.
But, yeah, and there was recently a publication where the X-ray refraction of the linen in the shroud was found to be comparable to linen that was discovered at Masada.
Hmm.
And listeners may know, the Jewish war in AD 70, Jerusalem was decimated, and the war between the Jews and the Romans went on until the fortress of Masada was decimated in AD 74. If I understand it correctly, everyone, men, women, and children, committed suicide before being captured by the Romans.
Yeah.
I've heard that there's a saying among the Jews that Masada never again. And so you can see their resilience and self-preservation. But so that linen goes to the 1st century. And if the X-ray refraction of that linen and the Shroud of Turin are similar in contradistinction to medieval linen or things manufactured later, that's also empiric evidence. And Schwartz would be quick to say, well, that's not a method of dating the cloth. And it's not, and he's correct. But it does have value in that it's a physical observation. It's an X-ray refraction of the linen that would be consistent with a 1st century cloth.
Yeah. Hi, Joe. Let me interrupt you here. I think we're going to take a break. And let's do this. We'll take a break here, and then we'll continue here after a short break, and we'll set up a second round on this. I'm speaking with Joe Bergeron. He is a medical doctor, and he's done quite a bit of work on understanding the crucifixion of Jesus. This is his book, The Crucifixion of Jesus. A medical doctor examines the death and resurrection of Christ. And we'll be right back.